Someone once asked me if people in Uganda ride elephants to work. I want to be clear, Uganda has elephants. We do not ride them, and I'm still not sure where that person thought we were keeping them. In the office car park? But honestly, that wasn't even the funny part. The funny part was that the same person in the same conversation asked me what language people speak in Africa. Africa, as a country, with one language, and apparently a parking lot full of office elephants. This is Explain It like I'm from Uganda. I'm Tobias. And today we are finally doing this episode. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will never hear the word Africa the same way again. Let's start with the problem. Most of the world has one picture of Africa, and it usually looks something like this. Dry land, hungry children, sad music playing under a charity advert, maybe a few wild animals in the background, one endless brown landscape stretching across the screen. Now, to be fair, some of those things exist. Poverty exists, drought exists, conflict exists, but that image gets used to represent an entire continent of 54 countries, 1.5 billion people, more than 2,000 languages, multiple climate zones, and some of the most culturally diverse societies on Earth, all reduced to one image, one emotion, one story. And here's the thing most people don't realize. Africa is enormous. You could fit the United States inside Africa and still have room left over. Then you could add China, then India, then most of Europe, and Africa would still not be full. The continent covers about 30.4 million square kilometers. But on most world maps, Africa appears roughly the same size as Greenland. Greenland is about 2.1 million square kilometers. Africa is 14 times larger. The reason for that distortion is something called the Mercator projection, a map design created in 1569 that stretches areas near the poles and shrinks areas near the equator. Africa sits near the equator. Europe does not. So Europe ends up looking much larger than it really is. And honestly, that map problem is just the beginning. Now let's talk about language, because I've genuinely been asked more than once what language people speak in Africa. The answer is over 2,000 languages. 2,000. And that's before you even count dialects. About a quarter of the world's languages spoken in Africa exist nowhere else on Earth. In Uganda alone, there are more than 40 different languages. The Baganda speak Luganda. The Acholi speak Acholi. The Banyankole speak Runyankole. The Karamoyong speak a completely different Nilotic language family. And that is just one country, one out of 54. So when someone asks, what language do Africans speak? They are trying to use one question to describe a reality that requires thousands of answers. But the language misunderstanding is only part of the issue. The deeper problem is the idea that Africa has no history, no complexity, no civilization outside the moment Europeans arrived, which is simply false. The kingdom of Kush in what is now Sudan had its own writing systems, pyramids, and trade networks thousands of years ago. The Mali Empire was one of the wealthiest empires on Earth in the 14th century. Timbuktu had universities and massive libraries, while parts of Europe were still struggling through the Middle Ages. Great Zimbabwe, a huge stone city built without mortar, was constructed centuries ago by the ancestors of the Shona people. These are not myths. These are documented historical facts. They just didn't make it into many school textbooks outside Africa. And then there's technology. People love acting like innovation only happens in Silicon Valley. Meanwhile, Africa built mobile money systems like M-Pesa years before Apple Pay existed. Rwanda has one of the highest percentages of women in parliament. anywhere in the world. Ethiopia launched a satellite into space. Nigeria's film industry, Nollywood, produces more films than Hollywood. None of this fits the single story people already have in their heads, which is probably why many people never hear about it. Now, here's the question that actually matters. Why does this still happen in 2026? We have the internet, streaming platforms, unlimited information. So why does the same flat version of Africa survive? Part of the answer is media. If you pay attention to international coverage of Africa, you'll notice a pattern. Wars get covered, famine gets covered, disease outbreaks get covered, political instability gets covered, but thriving tech industries, growing economies, peaceful elections, expanding middle classes, those stories travel much less. Not necessarily because journalists are evil, but because bad news attracts attention, and bad news that confirms people's existing assumptions spreads even faster. So the image keeps reinforcing itself. Another part of the problem is education. For many people outside Africa, school lessons about the continent were basically this: Africa exists. There was slavery, there was colonization, then independence, there are animals and some problems. End of chapter. Meanwhile, huge parts of African history, philosophy, science, architecture, and political thought never make it into the curriculum at all. A continent gets reduced to a footnote, and the consequences are real, because the single story doesn't just affect culture, it affects money, it affects investment, it affects tourism. If businesses constantly hear that a continent is unstable, dangerous, and poor, many won't invest there, even when individual countries are growing rapidly. Africa has around 17% of the world's population, but receives only a small fraction of global foreign direct investment. Perception matters. Tourism works the same way. People fly to Europe for history, to Asia for culture, to South America for nature. Africa has all of those things too. Ancient churches in Ethiopia, historic Medinas in Morocco, world-class food in South Africa, beaches in Zanzibar, mountain gorillas in Uganda, but many people never even consider those experiences because the image in their mind never included them. The single story shapes what people expect to find, and that shapes where money goes. Now let me give you the real picture. Africa is the youngest continent on Earth. The median age is around 19. Europe's median age is more than double that. By 2050, 1 in 4 human beings on Earth will be African. That is not just a demographic statistic. That is one of the largest emerging consumer markets in human history. Africa also has enormous natural resources, huge agricultural potential, rapidly growing cities, expanding digital infrastructure, and one of the fastest growing working age populations on Earth. And then there's the diversity. In Morocco, you can walk through markets that have existed for centuries and then go skiing in the Atlas Mountains. In Ethiopia, you can visit churches carved directly into rock hundreds of years ago that are still in use today. In South Africa, you can eat at world-class restaurants and then drive into a wildlife reserve the same afternoon. In Uganda, you can trek mountain gorillas in the morning and be on a boat on Lake Victoria by evening. These are not separate worlds. They are all Africa, one continent, 54 countries. And honestly, that's the point I want people to understand. Africa is not one thing. It is not one culture, not one language, not one story. And if you are African, I think we also need to stop repeating the single story about ourselves. There's a kind of self-deprecating humor we sometimes use that sounds harmless, but often just repeats old stereotypes written by people who never really understood the continent in the first place. That script deserves retirement. And if you're not African, here's all I'd ask. Be specific. When you hear Africa, ask which country, which people, which language, which history. Because the moment you start asking more specific questions, the flat picture falls apart. And underneath it is something much more interesting. Here's the thing I want to end on. Africa is not a country, but it is something extraordinary. It is the birthplace of humanity. The oldest evidence of human life on Earth comes from this continent. The first tools, the earliest migrations, the beginnings of human civilization. Every human being alive today traces their ancestry back here. That's not politics, that's archaeology and genetics. And the continent that gave humanity its beginning deserves more than a charity poster and a question about office elephants. 54 countries, 1.5 billion people, over 2,000 languages, the oldest history on Earth, the youngest population on Earth, and some of the greatest untapped potential on Earth. Not a country. A continent is a very large, very complicated, very interesting continent. And it existed long before someone drew it too small on a map. That's episode 11 of Explain It Like I'm from Uganda. I'm Tobias, and if this changed the way you think about Africa, share it. And if you know someone who still thinks we ride elephants to work, please send it to them immediately.